Hey, it's Homebuyer Radio. This is episode number 94. Dan Moralez here with you. I like to go by Dan the Mortgage Man. If you hear a lawnmower in the background, that is because the grass at my condo is being cut today. So I apologize for some extra noise there. But hey, this past weekend, I got a email from one of my clients. I shouldn't say one of my clients as much as a listener. Who ideally should be a client of mine, right? So Renee, if you're listening, this week's podcast, you're the inspiration of, right? Anyways, Renee is out in San Diego and is looking at the possibility of moving to maybe someplace that's a little more reasonable from, just the overall cost perspective. And then there's a couple of different things that are kind of going on for her. And what I told her I would do is if she didn't mind, I was going to use her email that she had sent me as kind of the, if you will, inspiration for this week's podcast. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to go through and just talk about, what happens when you're relocating from one area to another. What happens if you're, if you were going to graduate from school and your income's going up and you don't have necessarily a lot of job history or history of making more money, and how does credit, if you're newly married, how does your spouse's credit impact you as an individual, right? So what we're going to probably do is take Renee's email and just try to chop it into a couple of different areas, if you will. Okay. The first one is if you're moving. Okay. So you're going to move, let's say, from California, and we're going to move to someplace that's maybe a little more reasonable from a cost perspective. That in and of itself is obviously not necessarily a big deal. Really what you want to look at, though, is we want to look at, what the employment picture is going to be at the new place. Okay. So if you have, let's say you're moving, cross country and you're going to stay in the same line of work or a similar line of work as to what you had, let's say back in California. In the new place, you're going to have the same line of work. Typically not going to be a big deal. You could even have a situation where you make less money because there's a difference in the cost of living, let's say from California to what it would be, let's say in, Minnesota or someplace like that. So in a case like that, if you're in the same line of work, doing kind of the same job, or what would be a reasonably like or similar type of job, usually not a big deal. As long as we can document what the employment's going to be at the new place, what the rate of compensation is going to be at the new place, that in and of itself is not necessarily a deal breaker. Okay. Now I'll give you an example. I had a client who lived in northern Michigan, and they were moving down here towards, kind of western Michigan, downstate. Now, in his case, he was an RN, got his license to be a nurse practitioner, and moved towards, the western Michigan area because it was a greater pool of potential jobs, if you will, for him, and he had a better opportunity to make more money. So that's a case where, somebody could relocate and, have a similar line of work and you'd still be A-okay. So, the big thing is, does it make sense? Is it reasonable? Is it something that, you should, that a reasonable person would, an underwriter would look at and say, okay, this is logical and it makes sense, right? If all of those things are, it's a logical move, similar line of work, and it makes sense, you're likely not going to have a problem with that. Okay. Now, in the case where the second kind of part of her question was, husband is in school now, and then he's going to, come, if you will, graduate from school and expecting income to double. Now, with the increase in income, he's not going to have a long history of doing that, right? So it's something that, is just relatively new because he graduated, with, a higher, maybe degree or a specialized degree where, he's going to have a higher income earning potential. So just like the last situation we just talked about where I had the client who moved downstate, he went to school, graduated, and was able to get his nurse practitioner license. So his income was going to go up because of that change. So he went from being an RN to being a nurse practitioner. That change, is probably a $30,000 to $40,000 a year difference in income for him, and that's okay. So he doesn't necessarily have a history of making those higher dollars, but that's okay because it, if you will, corresponds or goes in line with what his education was. And he's, working in a field that his, if you will, degree was focused in. Okay. So in this case, the same thing is true for Renee's husband. If he finds employment in the field in which he went to school for, and the level of compensation is much higher than what his current level of compensation is, that's a-okay. So that's not a problem. You can do that. You don't have to have this long history of it. We're just looking to show that it matches up with kind of what his area of education was in, and again, it's reasonable and logical that graduating he would make more money in the new job. So that would be acceptable as well too. Okay, and then as far as the change for her, we did talk about that. You just have to be able to show that it's a similar position, similar line of work, similar field. Compensation can totally be different from one part of the country to another, so that would make sense as well there too. Okay, one of the other parts of her question was just the impact of credit. Okay, so if you get married and let's just say one spouse has really good credit, let's say you have one person who has like a 800 credit score, and maybe the other spouse has a credit score that's maybe in the lower 600s or something like that. Okay, so when the bank makes a mortgage, and I think we've talked about this in one of the previous episodes, but when the bank makes a mortgage, what happens is we're making that mortgage based on the lower of the two credit scores. Okay. So in the case of, let's just say, maybe one spouse has, an 800 credit score and the other one's, 600, when the bank determines eligibility for the mortgage and pricing for the mortgage and stuff like that, they're going to work off the 600 credit score, not the 800. So you're going to work off the lower of the two. Now, sometimes you can get around that by, taking the person who has the lower score off the loan altogether. We've done that a number of times where the person who has the higher score is able to qualify for the mortgage on their own, and then we just, write the loan to them using the higher credit score. They get the more favorable terms, and it just works out to be a better deal for them altogether. Now, there are times where that's not the case. Maybe, the primary wage earner is the person who has the lower credit score. Well, when that happens, you have to work off the lower of the two credit scores. And so if there's not a way to qualify, the one person with a higher credit score, then sometimes you're kind of stuck where you got to use that person who has a lower score as part of the deal. Now, again, that can impact eligibility, because what's going to happen is we're going to use that person's score to determine overall eligibility, again, the rate and the terms for the loan and so on. So, sometimes you can creatively find a way around it, and other times you can't. But what you cannot do is you cannot average the two, okay? So that's not an option. You're always going to use the person who has the lowest score. That's going to be the person that kind of sets the bar, if you will, for what rates and terms and eligibility for the mortgage are going to be when it's all said and done. So part of the question was, can one spouse bring down the other spouse as part of the mortgage process? The answer is absolutely yes, especially if one person, has a really low score and they're the primary wage earner. It can really have a big impact on your overall ability to be able to get a mortgage. Okay. In regards to that, sometimes, if you know that you have some of those, issues, sometimes a good thing is to, start like a mortgage pre-approval process earlier. Even though you may not, be looking to buy immediately, sometimes it's not a bad idea to start that process now, know exactly kind of where you're at now, and get a game plan together on the steps that you can take to be able to put yourself in a better position to be able to qualify for a mortgage when you're ready. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Again, I just really appreciate when listeners reach out with emails, and more importantly, when they reach out to buy a house. That really is what this podcast is all about, right? I'm not trying to sell you something. I'm just trying to educate you about the mortgage process. Hopefully, in the process of getting an education about the mortgage process, you'll reach out to us when it's time for you to make that purchase and to buy that house. A number of you have. I've had the opportunity to work with a number of listeners who listen to the podcast, so I'm super, super grateful for that. And I just ask that you do me a favor, please share the podcast with others. Share it on social media. If you can, please go on iTunes and leave a 5-star review, and just help us to get the word out there. Okay, we're not giving you a hard sale. We're not giving you a bunch of pressure to hurry up and take a mortgage as much as is just kind of sharing with you the experiences of a mortgage guy who's been doing this since 1991. And hopefully, as I kind of go through this and share with you stories and experiences, it helps you to learn more about the mortgage process, but it helps you hopefully to feel, more, or I should say better educated about this process as well, too. Again, my name is Dan Moralez. I go by Dan the Mortgage Man. You can find me online at danmoralez.com. That's DANMORALEZ.com. Phone number is 616-931-4629. Again, 616-931-4629. My NMLS number is 709-729, and Northpointe Bank is an equal housing lender.